Kendi. And if you've been tuning in over the last several weeks, you know we've had panels comprised of educational leaders in our community, law enforcement officials, religious leaders, business leaders, community political leadership, even student activists, student leaders. And tonight is a very special edition of the community-wide book read, as we have tried to assemble a cross-section of all of the panelists so that we can have a more lengthy discussion with these experts in their various fields of work. And then we want to hear their reflections on the book, and how do we flesh out or flush out those reflections in a way that they turn into some real policy recommendations to make communities stronger, make it better. And also, where I have been the host for the short 30-minute segments, tonight I'm being joined by the Reverend Dr. Dave Kivett, who is also with us tonight, and he and I both will share the host role as we try to engage these panelists. Again, I just want to acknowledge Gwen Culpepper Berry. She's the Chief Diversity Officer at UNI, and we certainly want to thank UNI in its role in spearheading this community-wide effort. And of course, the Community Collaborative, comprised of so many different people from so many different walks of life to help make this community book read a success. So we appreciate their labor of love in this great effort. And so now I think we're ready to begin. We want to work with these people who are spending a portion of their time with us tonight. We do want to acknowledge that there may be some that have to leave a little early. So we want to make sure we get that out up front. Please don't become disillusioned or disappointed because your favorite panelist just left the show. So just hang in there with us, but some may have to leave a little early. But we're certainly grateful for those who were able to make time with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. We hope now that everybody's had an opportunity to read the book, maybe twice, to digest what Kendi was talking about in all of these chapters. Controversial, yes, but what did you think about the ending? Did anybody really get thrown by the ending in any significant way? Anybody want to talk about that a little bit? And if not, since I don't see anybody just volunteering, I'm just going to introduce the co-host tonight, Dave Kivett. Dave, do you want to get us started? You have a question that you would like to kind of kick everybody off after you make a statement yourself?
Sure, I'd be glad to answer your question and then can throw another one out. I like the way it ended. It was a bit of a shock to find out about his cancer diagnosis. One of the things that I appreciate about the book is that it's part memoir, part scholarly effort. And I like his humility. I like his honesty in the book. I don't agree with everything he says, but I really like that. Because if we're going to do any better in building bridges in our community, we need more humility and we need more honesty. And we need to have difficult conversations. So I appreciate that. And I like the way it ends. We're talking about how you treat cancer. I've had cancer in my life, in my family, and I have seen how drastic the treatment is for chemo and radiation therapy. And if we're going to address racism, we can't dance around it and be all polite. We've got to have some pretty radical therapies that address it. And I thought it was a good image. And so the question I would ask along those lines are, what therapies do y'all have in mind in your areas where you are active in the community, where you can make this a better community by being an anti-racist? What positive effect can you bring forth in this community through your position at the health department or in the union or in a university setting or in a political office or as a business leader or as a community activist? What difference can you make based on your reading of this book? What are you jonesed up to do?
I'll go first if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Jared Seliger, president at Allen College here in Waterloo. And, I think what our remedy is, and obviously I'm representing the education sector, but obviously education plays such a huge role in making a difference in people's lives. And, you know, that was part of, you know, my enlightenment of reading this book. Was it was an education for me. We're never too old to stop learning. We're never too young to start learning. And for us, and specifically what we're doing here at Allen, is we're really trying to engage our youth and give the young members of our community an opportunity to learn and be educated and to get a good education, so we can break the cycle of racism, and we give people opportunities to, you know, have a career and be able to raise their families and make a positive difference within the community. So that's something that we can do, and we can all get behind and support. And, you know, we can provide the resources, but it takes everyone in the community to provide the students with the encouragement or the support, whether it's physical, emotional, and that's going to be one of the ways that we're going to be able to fight racism within our community and within the world.
Well, thank you for sharing that. One of the things Abraham and I want to do is follow up with some more specific questions in each of your areas. We sent you via email some questions to consider in your line of work. And one of the things we've run into in terms of healthcare, Jared, is I saw one study where they talked about there's a perception that Black women in particular can handle more pain than white women can. It's not a clinical study, but it's an assumption made by healthcare workers. So what are you doing at Allen College to challenge some of the assumptions that your students bring into the classroom that may be discriminatory?
Well, I mean, I think, again, going back to, you know, it comes down to the people that we have, you know, teaching the courses both here on campus and then, of course, in a clinical setting, and just making sure, like you said, to challenge what's in the textbook. And I think, you know, Kendi was, you know, pretty adamant about, you know, how history has been written. It's through, you know, mostly a white lens, and we want to make sure that what we're teaching our students, especially in the healthcare side of things, that there are different races, there are different cultures, and how people, the perceptions of pain tolerance, or, you know, having family members in the room with them when procedures are being done. So just making sure that we're providing the resources necessary to ensure that, number one, our faculty are appropriately trained, they have the qualifications necessary, they have access to resources, but then just also challenge them through their own personal experiences. Not everything you're going to learn in healthcare you're going to find in a textbook. It's those human interactions that you deal with and learn from, and having good instructors with those experiences allows us to, you know, educate our students so they can make better healthcare, you know, experiences for our patients, regardless of who they are. It's about treating the patient where they're at in their particular, you know, illness or disease, and making sure that we're there for them no matter what their needs are.
Good. Fabulous. Dr. Igbonia, did you have a thought to the same question?
I think that there's historically there's a notion about strength, the strength of Black people. You know, you hear stereotypes even about slavery and Blacks being able to survive slavery. So there's a historical perception about strength and about different races being able to survive certain things than others. And so I think that really is something that carries across, you know, within the healthcare system. I'm hearing echoes. I don't know if it's on my end.
Yeah, I did hear that as well. I don't know if Rick can address that, but please try to keep going. He might be able to do it as you.
Yeah, so I think that it just carries over with the Black body, as though, you know, that the care isn't as needed, right? So there's studies that show that Black babies survive better with Black physicians in comparison when they're taken care by white physicians, you know? And so those are things that the healthcare system needs to really look at. and study closely as to why that's happening, because there might be a perception there that's already that, oh, this infant will most likely survive because they're Black and be neglected, not carefully watched. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the data.
Yeah, wow. Wow. Did you have another question?
Do I have another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I love Zoom and the Hollywood Squares kind of feel to it. So why don't we move from one doctor to another and move to Dr. Fitzgerald
Okay.
and talk about assumptions in his line of work. And maybe we can hear from Chief Hare as well about how they address those assumptions. And one of the questions we also had for you in law enforcement that you may be able to speak to tonight or in the future is about the composition of your police force. What is the racial and gender composition of your police force? And then also what efforts are being made to recruit persons of color to serve on those police forces? So those are some questions for y'all to play with, or you can just say what you feel like saying in the first place.
Well, I guess from my perspective, as a police chief and as a Black man, anti-racism is a commitment that you have to make. It has to be intentional and an intentional culture change within your agency. We've seen now that adjusting police policies and behaviors that are racist or that, let's say, simply have racist outcomes for stakeholders is unacceptable. It does not matter whether it is negatively affecting someone who is Black, red, brown, yellow. It just is unacceptable that there's an inequality there. So as law enforcement, we are charged with upholding the Constitution. And in order to be seen as procedurally just in the eyes, or I should say procedurally just and legitimate in the eyes of the persons that we serve, and I emphasize service, by everyone in the community, we have to behave in a democratic manner and have the courage to correct, let's say, those who fail to do so. And that is sometimes, it requires pruning the tree. And that tree inside your agency may be folks that have been there for their entire careers and see what they have been doing as acceptable. And reversing that mindset is intentional. It's like dealing with cancer. Dealing with cancer is an intentional injection of chemotherapy into the system, introducing something into the system that causes the fight. And you can't shy away from the fight in a position of leadership in law enforcement nowadays, especially when trying to diversify a police department. Much is said about police departments' emphasis upon diversity and how well we do in reversing bad past practices of hiring. And what most people don't realize is that those bad past practices can't be addressed overnight. There has to be an influx of folks that are that leave an agency first. I'm not going to say that you can't hire an all Black class or an all Latino class or an all LGBTQI plus class or any type of diverse class that you'd like to hire. However, and that's intentional, right? You can intentionally hire, but what you can't do is prune the tree and make people walk away. And when people are in your agency, have been the fabric of an agency for a long time and are doing their jobs basically the way you taught or the way they were taught to do so, you're many times left with an agency that, although it needs cultural change, doesn't have the facility to bring in that change overnight. So you have to train, you have to put people in uncomfortable positions and do the things that in particular, hold people to the level of accountability necessary to ensure that you're delivering the services in a legal, democratic, and just manner. So changing things overnight in a police agency, yes, you can, if city council or whatever governing body you answer to gives you the ability to all of a sudden hire 20 more people, sure, you can make diverse decision-making picks. You can pick 10 Blacks, you can pick 10 women, you can pick and mix and match where your needs are. However, the reality is most times you don't have the opportunity to do a mass hire like that that will change the percentages of diversity in your agency overnight. And that is why it is critical to be intentional about your expectations and how culturally diverse folks are handled and how we respond to that and how we democratically, again, I go back to democratic and I use intentional on purpose, provide service. And when people don't and can't adjust to the new culture of the organization, I use the pruning of the tree analogy again. That's when you have an opportunity to sort of out with the old, in with the new. And, as a police chief, you face internal pushback and you face external pushback for trying to diversify, and it takes courage. And absent that courage, you can stagnate as an agency, and many agencies across the country suffer from that.
Well, I think that's powerful. And Helen Hare, are you wrestling with any equity issues there, you and I?
We do. I would echo what Chief Fitzgerald said. He's absolutely correct, spot on his observations and his experience. It's not an overnight process. First of all, you have to have the positions available, just like he said. We can't create those out of thin air. Most police departments that I know of, you have a finite number of positions that are funded. And if you are fortunate, like he said, to get more, that's great. That would be a wonderful thing, but budgets don't always allow for that. And for those people, once again, to reiterate what he said, is there may be people who are so ingrained into the department, 20, 25, 30 years, depending on your departments. In some ways, that's a good thing because that means you have a steady, known workforce, and you probably have some pretty good working conditions. But on the other hand, that can be challenging if those people are not willing to potentially evolve and change and become more adaptable. And that's where the education and the training comes in. And I know, that since these conversations started, it's critical that officers, have the information available. Education is so important because so many times officers, they may come in after and say, I never thought about that, or I never looked at it that way. And it can be pretty difficult conversations sometimes. And we're fortunate, we're a small department, so we're pretty informal with each other. And, I have had officers come into my office after a training and be humbled, I would say, to a certain extent, because they were not aware of certain things that had happened in our history. And that's good, but it can be difficult to have that conversation, especially when you have somebody. I appreciate what David said at the beginning, that even though he didn't necessarily agree with everything in the book, he appreciated the candor and the humility of the author. I think that goes over into, even though we may not agree, we still have to understand that we're both trying to get to the same place and that we're doing it with good intentions, and have those potentially uncomfortable conversations. That even though I disagree with you, let's talk through it. And
I think that's beautiful. I'm just going to interject here. Dave will probably give the next question, but just a little housekeeping. We want to make sure that everyone is muting their mics when you're not talking, because I think that's interfering a little bit with some of the sound. And let me just interject a little comment here. We can agree to disagree, and this is also something that I think should guide our conversations, especially when we're talking about racism and those kinds of things. We can agree to disagree, but if your disagreement is rooted in my oppression or in my dehumanization, then that's problematic. And that will entail a different kind of discussion. But anyway, Dave.
Can I say
David,
something
would you-
else? Can I say one more thing? It's
Go
it's
for it.
interesting. It's interesting that you say that, Abraham, because
Yes, sir.
you know, many times, you know, we as African Americans look at the leaders of organizations because they're not always African American and say, you know, those leaders aren't doing enough to make changes. But as an African American in a leadership position where diversity change must happen, right? And the implementation of diversity change has to be, again, intentional. I live by something, and I say this all the time. If it's not uncomfortable or challenging or inconvenient, right? You're not trying. And in the context of this book, you're not trying. I think this is resounding, right, throughout the entire book. You're not trying if it's not uncomfortable and you're not doing what's necessary to be anti-racist. So if you're thinking that way, for anyone that's not Black or a person of color that leads, understand that it is just as difficult for someone that looks like me to go into an agency and change the culture of the agency as well. It takes as much courage, it takes as much determination. And I'm not going to say more so, I will say this, especially if you're going into a racially polarized organization and you're the minority and you're trying to make these changes, because you hear things or you read bylines in the comment sections that says, here comes affirmative action, or here comes this, or here comes that. And it goes back to just being able to do what's right, even when no one's looking. In this case, everyone's looking, but you're still doing what's right. And you have to know in your heart that intentionally you were doing things because it's the right thing to do, because you're anti-racist.
Abram, can I add into this a minute?
Go ahead, Rich.
You know, some might call it the Pollyanna glasses or concept, but sitting there watching a bunch of 5-year-olds one day and them playing in a playground, they had no clue of anything with color, race. I mean, it was really neat. But I don't know if that would be something that people need to see more of. 5-year-olds playing in a playground together, and color has nothing to do with what they're doing or how they're interacting. And to think, where does that cancer that we are here about today, where does that start? And how do we try and, whether it's Pollyanna thinking, go back to the 5-year-old concept or mindset that we're still all human beings and we like to play in the playground together? I don't know. At some point, it's like a switch, or is it just constant that we deal with all around us that takes that mentality from that 5-year-old to the cancer stuff that we've dealt with in the past?
Okay. Well, why don't we take that comment and pair it with what the chief said earlier. I really love the image of pruning the tree. So let's talk about how to move from Pollyanna to either some specific actions of pruning the tree. What are some things that need to stop happening in our community? What are some things we need to stop doing? And then what are some things we need to start doing? What are some things we need to plant? My friend Latanya tells me several times, almost every time we speak, you're not part of the struggle unless you're willing to make some sacrifices. So let's talk about some branches that need to get pruned or some plants that need to get planted. And I think that will move us past the Pollyanna. And Rich, I'll say one thing about Pollyanna and then I'll stop talking. Waterloo is considered the most diverse city in Iowa, and it's 73% white. Cedar Falls is 93% white. And you don't see too many kids of mixed races playing on the playgrounds in Cedar Falls. And one of the truths we have to recognize is we live segregated lives. So that mixture of children that we want to see doesn't happen enough in our community, because particularly in Iowa, there are a lot of white people who grow up around a lot of other white people. And that's it. So that's my rant / sermon, but let's go back to the questions and let me go to Latanya. Let's talk about something that needs to be pruned or planted, please.
And as you said that, Dave, I was sitting here thinking, is he going to mention that? But he's right. At almost every meeting, I tell them, if you're truly fighting for social justice and you're advocating for the disenfranchised, then you cannot be afraid to call out your family members, coworkers, and friends that are racist. Because if you're afraid to do that, who are you assisting? And so in my heart, I feel that everyone that is fighting for equality and social justice for everyone, in my heart, I feel that they're doing it for the right reason. But then you find out that you have implants, or someone put it to me, trolls, and I didn't understand the concept, but they were like, LaTanya, they're not really there to assist. They're there to find out what's going on so they can take the information back. And so I said, oh, well, I'm an open book. And everybody that knows me knows that I'm passionate about what I do. And it does not matter what your skin color is, what your sexual orientation is, what your religion is. None of that matters. When you're being discriminated against, I'm going to do everything in my power to assist you. And so when I share with people that the NAACP was founded to fight for the rights of all people, even though it was at a time when we were the ones being lynched and murdered and crucified and the whole 9 yards, we founded the NAACP to fight for the rights of all people. And so when people find that out, it's like a light bulb that comes off in their head, like, wow, I didn't know that. And then a lot of people think we're just a Black organization. And I'm like, no, it was founded by both Blacks and whites who were fighting for the rights of all people. And so until we truly, truly, truly search our souls and do just that, nothing's gonna change. That's just my opinion. So when we're out here fighting, we have to be sure that someone can't come up to us and say, well, you were at a meeting with several of your white colleagues, and someone came back to me and said, you said this. And I remember listening to a show on KBBG, and it was a guy being interviewed, and he said he grew up in a diverse neighborhood, went to the service, was around every nationality you can think of, but he was with some of his white coworkers and they were cracking racist jokes about Black people. And he said he didn't speak up. And so he said, but today it won't happen. And so when people know where you stand, when they truly know where you stand, either they're going to be with you or they're going to be against you. And so again, if we're fighting for the rights of all people, then we're not going to care what others think of us, because we're doing it because liberty and justice for all. And when you find people that don't stand when they're saying the Pledge of Allegiance, that is the reason why, because they feel there is no liberty and justice for all. That's my 2 cents.
No, that was about 5 cents, LaTanya. Come on, that was at least 5 cents.
Okay, well, thank you.
Laura, you want to set us straight, all these older people? Let's hear from a student about what the future really holds and what we need to do. Set us straight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Roman Jimenez. I serve as a student at UNI. I currently serve as a director of diversity for student government, and I serve as a member of the Racial Ethnic Coalition student activism group on campus. This is very interesting that you say that, because I was just thinking, coming from a younger standpoint, I definitely have different viewpoints than maybe some of you all might have. Mine might be a little bit more grandiose at times. We're going a little bit farther than some may expect. And what I was thinking here is, this book is a great beginner a great sample at how to begin at many things. When I talked with my reading group, a lot of these things are things that we already knew, we had already studied in classes, but reading with other people or going into other groups, for them, these are the first time they are recognizing these issues. So it's very interesting how we see that. And what especially struck me is in one of the last chapters, he talked about what comes first, if you change people's minds or if you change policies. And what we face for the most part is it's very difficult to change people's minds. I have walked protests here in Cedar Falls on Main Street where we had people come out and yell at us and yell racial slurs at us. You know, it hasn't been easy, and it's very, I remember being on the bike trails just about 3 years ago, and I reached a certain point and I looked down and there was a swastika, and I immediately knew that this wasn't a safe place for me to be. So I was definitely lost, but like still, I had to find a way to get back home. I've lived in the Cedar Falls for quite some time now, and as you've noted, it is a very white area, and the certain microaggressions that I faced here, it's very interesting. But I do think we need to focus on policy a lot, and especially because we talk a lot as if diversity is the step to take, and we're forgetting that it is not the step, but a step. We're forgetting a lot about equity. I'm sure many people have seen the little graphic of people like trying to climb up a fence to the baseball field, and how oftentimes we think of it as like equality where everyone has like the same stepping stone, but we see people have different heights. We have to recognize that we all come from different backgrounds. So somebody else might need a little bit more help than somebody else does. I might need a little bit more help than somebody else because of certain historically marginalized oppression identities that we have had. So that's why sometimes we're talking about like everyone, we are all the same no matter what you are. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, because we all come from different viewpoints and we should totally recognize that. That's when we're talking about maybe like color blindness. If you say, I see you as a human being, I do not see you as your color, I would hope you do see me from what I am, because that is an important part of my identity. And then how I interact with you and how you interact with me is going to change depending on what background I come from. So I think we should really recognize that within the people. And then of course, as we were stating in Cedar Falls and Waterloo, how they're so segregated, I think we should definitely make a point for cities to recognize why that is. Cedar Falls being, having a history of being a sundown town, you know, in how people were able to buy houses or not buy houses, depending on who they were, the safety of people of color in Cedar Falls. I think that needs to be something that we should recognize as a city, why that is. We should get to the root of that, and then we can move on from there.
I think you're hitting on something that's that I wanted to mention when I spoke, but I didn't, and I'll mention it now. It's that people of color, especially those that are victimized by racism, much like you just seeing the swastika, right? You know, it had an effect upon you, a profound effect, really. And when you're being victimized, or you're made to feel the way you were made to feel when people scream racial epithets at you, you know, you say to yourself, and an author said this, I can't quote her, I know her last name was Simmons, but she said, if I'm being harmed by racism, don't ask me to do the work. The work should be done because, especially here in Iowa, right? Dr. Jane Elliott is from Iowa. I mean, this is like, you know, the treatise on how you raise children not to be racist, right? The blue-eyed, brown-eyed concept, you know, goes back years and years, and you would think that we would be in a situation or in an area where we would not be made to feel the way you've been made to feel. But in reality, one of the most profound experiments has been done here in Iowa, yet it hasn't changed the delivery from those who need to do the work. You and I, and maybe others of color, are so frustrated, and we get frustrated because we don't feel like we should have to carry all of this to change other people's opinions. And I don't want to speak for you, but I wanted to sort of, you know, intertwine that into what I delivered first, and I didn't, but I'm glad you brought up what you did, because I think it enabled me to touch on it.
I'm glad you added what you said, Dr. Fitzgerald. I want to move to Dr. Naomi McCormick. And I wanted to, you know, ask you to engage that idea a little bit further. I mean, what comes first? Laura mentioned something that I think resonates with all of us, but you're in the field of psychology, you're also in the field of ministry. What comes first, policy change or this notion of heart change? You're mute.
I think policy change comes first, because we've seen that. I'm old enough to remember decades of struggles that people have, and we've seen that their heart does not change until the circumstances of people's lives change. And that's what Kendi said, and it's something I forgot, and it's something that he reminded me of again, that's really important.
That's helpful.
And so what we have to accept is when we do social change, not everyone's going to go along with this very well. And it does remind me, I'm a retired psychologist, but I was in practice for 45 years. And the same goes with changing one's life. Not everyone goes along with it. Somebody who's been emotionally abused, who's now standing up for themselves, they're not going to be popular with the people in their life who bullied them. And there's no way that you can do any endeavor that moves a human being forward, whether it's spiritually, psychologically, or socially, without there being a lot of pain and a lot of people thinking you're doing the wrong thing and not shutting up about it.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a question to the group because it's a great question about what comes first. But who makes policies? Like, who creates policies? You know, we talk about race as a social construct, right? And that comes from human beings. And so I think human beings also create policy. And I struggle very much about that, where we're focused a lot about policy. I believe in policy, but my action when we ask about what can we do is really that accountability piece, because you can have policies whereby there's no accountability behind that. And we have to remember that human beings are the ones that create policy. So if the policy is not rooted from the heart and there's no accountability system, how can we guarantee that this policy is actually working? And so I think for me, you know, at the health department, this transformative approach that we've taken, we've understood that, oh, we have to be accountable. So I want to ensure that equity is in the walls of the organization, you know, without having a person of color. Like, there has to be a system of accountability so that when there's when the organization starts to change or divert in a different direction, at least there'll be people that will look at it and say, wait, why is this data shifting? What's happening here? Why is the number of recruitments that are occurring are shifting one direction while before it was another, right? So for me, I really think it's a combination of both. You know, I think that you know, it's exciting to think about it from a policy angle, but I think it's important that we remember it's human beings that create policies just the same way as it's human beings that have created these racial constructs.
Yeah. That's a great question, Dr. Abonye, and I think it would be great talking about policy to refer that question to the Honorable Mayor of Waterloo. Let him talk about policy. Mayor Hart, your thoughts.
Hey, thank you. Thank you again for everyone putting together these panel discussions. And I think before even talking about policy, I think the education and the recognition that there is imbalance, there is inequities, and tools like this book, tools like other educational materials help people to be able to get a grasp and to be able to actually see it and recognize it. And, you know, for some of us, we may not necessarily have the privilege to not recognize that something is imbalanced because it's placed upon the backs of African Americans and others to be able to deal with the negative effects of bad policies and practices. I think, you know, and right now, I know Mr. Funches and the Human Rights Commission have began a conversation about an equity diversity toolkit and seeing how that will apply here locally. And, you know, whether it is the entire toolkit, whether it is pieces of the toolkit, whether it is something that's created by the commission that's more localized in partnership with my office, that's a huge step in the right direction, because there's hundreds of decisions that are made every day across this entire country. And if you don't ever stop to take a look at through a critical lens or through an equity lens, like Ms. Jimenez mentioned, then even your good intentions could wind up being something bad for the community. And to give you an example or two, and I know in the chat box, it was asked about some of the policies or ideas that we said we would have a discussion about. And, you know, right now, let's take a look at something simple for the city of Waterloo, right? So when the street reconstruction program was put together with the local option sales tax, there was a concern by some of our council members, and rightfully so, that the dollars that are spent to go on roads need to be equally distributed to every ward, right? So I was a 4th Ward representative, and I'll tell you, I used to advocate for our road projects, and we made sure that every ward got the same amount of money. But what do you do when you have 5 wards and you have 2 of your oldest wards, and I'm just going to throw out a number, just don't quote me on a number, where you have 1 ward where the roads are 55% bad, you have another ward where the roads are 75% bad, and you have another ward where the roads are 20% bad. So if you follow an equality model, you'll have roads continuing to get worse in one area, and in the other area, they'll be improved, because equality and equity are different in these situations. Mm-hmm. So by having a critical lens and taking a look at what we do as policy, another example, when Highway 63 went through the north side of Waterloo, according to research and studies by universities, it was one of the most damaging, detrimental impacts overall to the Black community and to that area. Economically, it disrupted things, and it's taking all the way from when Highway 63 was put in to becoming mayor for us to finally start to take a look at the Logan Plaza area, and then to be able to create investment, work with Allen Hospital and a number of partners and developers to try to reform and transform that area. We take a look at Chamberlain's, where OSHA policies have had an impact on what people have been allowed to do for environmental protection practices. And so all along the pendulum, you know, those policies were never meant to be an advantage for poor, low income, or minority communities. But having an equity perspective in the way that we approach that, making sure that when we create a policy, we ask that question, how does this have an impact on minorities? How does this have an impact on people? How does this have an impact on the gender pendulum? By asking those questions, we're able to make sure that the policies don't have detrimental impacts, and that we're not continuing the continuation of practicing policies that disparate people. You know, policing was one huge one. And so now the policies and practices that the chief and his administrative staff are putting into play are to create equity in situations. So it's taking a look at everything we do, from street projects to housing practices, and making sure that you're not going to continue having horrible rental properties in neighborhoods while you live in other neighborhoods and get rich off the backs of those that are in a less stable financial situation. But this thing is hundreds of years of things that have been done to imbalance the structures in which we live in. And the challenge to me is it's not going to happen overnight. And, and moving from an emotional policy to actually changing and recognizing policy is a lifetime worth of work, and it takes time. And, I'm hoping that systemically we are starting to move in some of those directions, but it's not glamorous. But hopefully we can continue to move in that direction.
But we are moving that needle. We are moving that needle. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Mark Cottrell.
I just hope that needle sometimes don't stick you in the, because it's tough. But together, having real conversations with people that are not afraid to upset the status quo, and that are willing to take time out to see how policies, practices, our own behaviors are impacting this entire equation.
And
Beautiful.
Dr. Abonye would point out that sometimes a needle stick is good for you. So I just got to push that needle analogy too much before my friend Abraham asked Mark a question.
When it's a vaccine.
That's beautiful,
right?
Dave. That's beautiful. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mark Cottrell, you were talking about housing development earlier. I think you were having a conversation with Scott Colbert. What did you all ultimately come up with? And of course, we didn't get a chance to capitalize on the expertise of Kara Dara before she had to leave. She announced ahead of time that she had to leave a little early tonight, so we missed out on her. But maybe you can capture some of her thought as you speak, Mark.
Well, happy to do the best that I can. And let me just go ahead and sign up for Quentin's Army here. It sounds like from a policy standpoint, Abraham, Dave, we got a leader right there. That's a great body of work that he's discussing. I think it'll keep me busy for the rest of my career anyway. So it's interesting because, I look at it, and I've worn a number of hats as a developer and, worked with regional economic development. I'm on the state economic development board. It's interesting because I also have kids that are in their 20s. And one of the most amazing statistics that I constantly hear and think about is, and it's so different from our generation, millennials make a decision on where they want to live first, and then they figure out how they're going to make a living where they want to live. And I mean, I think that's the thing that we need to think about here. And, having a safe and diverse and welcoming community is one of the most important things. And, we talk about it over and over and over about, we're Iowans and we're so welcoming and everything else. But, I think we just have to look at each other in the mirror and say, really? I mean, is this really what we're projecting, and how are we having these kind of conversations and involving people? I love the young people and the older people that are both on this panel. So, what I'm really interested in, and, we did it very well, I think, in downtown Cedar Falls, was we really created a stock of housing that wasn't represented here in the community. There are so many young people that want to move to a big city. They want a big city lifestyle and all of the things that go along with it. But, the interesting part is they can't afford it in a lot of cases. They can't, stomach the traffic and there's safety problems that go along with it. We did a look early on and said, if we could really have that sort of urban lifestyle, but we could also have it in a small town sort of inclusive and safe sort of way, keep the cost of living in a way, we have something that really could be amazing. And I think, that's the thing that I'm looking at the most. We have got to figure out how to grow our population. We're getting older, we're getting, wider, and, unfortunately, the nation is going in the opposite direction. And we've got to get on the train, and we've got to start to work on it. So I feel like, and I know Mayor Hart's been working, I know Carrie Dara's been working. I think there's, a whole housing discussion that really could happen. I don't know a lot of the history of the redlining. I know it certainly happened in our community. I certainly, Laura, I heard your comments about, there are people in Cedar Falls and there are people in Waterloo. I think the affordability of housing difference between the two communities is something we've got to talk about, and we've got to put policies together, not just talk about it, but put policies together. If we can, we find in Cedar Falls, in the work that we've done, that you can claim a block, literally a block at a time, and you can go in, and in some cases there are houses that need to be rehabbed. In some cases there are houses that could be rebuilt. There are some cases where there might be a need for a different kind of house, like a multifamily sort of, or even a senior sort of spot. I think we've really got to do that planning work and work in conjunction with the private sector and the public sector. I can tell you at the state level, there's a tremendous interest in what can we do in communities like Waterloo and Cedar Falls to make them more, easier for people to come into and feel safe in and feel involved in. And housing is, I think, one of the really key components of that.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful.
I'd like to chime in on that a little, and the housing and development piece. I'm from Pennsylvania originally. And a lot of the work that was done around redlining and public housing emanated from studies in Pennsylvania. I can tell you this, that young families that are looking to come into a community and relocate, millennial families, are looking to start families to work and have their commute. They don't mind the commute, but what they want to do is come home to a decent sized home in a community that has public education and that's available to them and available to their growing family. So you don't find many young people that want to go and move into a downtown area that does not have or is not zoned to a high performing school. So you marry the redevelopment downtown and the lure of a downtown redevelopment with that of, let's say, a high performing charter school or private school. And you see those communities are really the communities that take off. The Allentown, Allentown is one of the communities I worked in, and they're basing some of their resurgence upon those type of principles as well. I mean, Detroit's a larger version of, what you're saying, where really the redevelopment is starting from the inside out. I am not in the redevelopment business here in the city of Fort Worth, but I'm responsible for the public safety in those areas. And I understand the need to ensure that you have a safe downtown, but the safe downtown, when you want to put the real bodies inside the buildings and the condominiums and everything else, the young folks that would be very interested in that bucolic sort of lifestyle downtown would do so with the promise of being able to not have to pay extra to raise a family and to have their kids go to a good school. So that is very much part of the problem that we see in racially polarized.
I would be remiss if I don't capitalize on your Freudian slip. You said you're not in housing development here in Fort Worth.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Cedar Valley as well. And I want to go back to the redlining comment. And Mark, I really appreciate you focusing on housing. I went to a workshop that Dr. Abonye did about a year ago at the Hawkeye campus downtown. And there was a great video that group shared about redlining in Waterloo. It was a very helpful resource. And if Dr. Abonye, if you could find that for us again and get it to either Abraham or to me, be glad to share that with all of you, because it helps to see history and see yourself in that history. And when it applied to Waterloo, that was helpful. The question I want to ask all of you to think about is a homework related question, tying to what Mark said about housing. What is the one thing that you're committed to do going forward, whether it's a policy change or whether it's an attitude change, a specific action? What is one thing that you want to do? Like, I'm a pastor, and my thing is this. One of the things that is really driving a lot of the racism today is white fear and the politics of white grievance, where there are far too many white people in our country today that feel like white people, particularly white Christians, are the targets of discrimination. And they're frightened. And I have to be able as a faith leader to say, if you want to talk about being a victim, talk to somebody who's actually been a victim first. You know, put some perspective on this, and then put some historical perspective on it in the fact from a faith tradition, our faith traditions, whether it's Judaism, Islam, Christianity, all focus on the fact that fear is not a faith value. Over and over again, Holy Scriptures in a variety of traditions say pretty much the same thing. Don't be afraid. And if we're making our decisions based on the fear of somebody else, oh, those immigrants are going to come and invade our country. We use the language of invasion. Somebody coming here to make a better life for their family is not invading our country. They're not a threat to you. So that's my area of focus, is I'm going to work on that fear angle. And that's kind of the way preachers talk anyway. So what's the one thing that you really want to work on in your area of interest and expertise? Who wants to go next? Who hadn't talked in a while? Jared, can we go back to you all the way back to the beginning?
And by the way, may I just encourage you all to keep your answers a little more compact, because we have about 25 minutes left and we want to give everybody an opportunity to contribute.
Can I point out he said that right after I spoke? Yeah, I just want to say that.
And right before I spoke, so.
Yeah, so yeah.
I'm getting the hook before I even get started. I think for us, one of the things we're absolutely committed to is continuing to promote how, especially African-American high schoolers have an opportunity to higher education in front of them. And I'll be honest, I mean, we are here for higher education, but we're also healthcare education, and know the impact that we need more diversity in our healthcare workforce. And we're sitting here as, the most diverse community in the state of Iowa. And, our demographics of our student enrollment don't match the demographics of the community. And we need to fix that. And we're trying to fix that through some of our pipeline programs. Certainly we have a great relationship with both the Waterloo and Cedar Falls Community Schools. The great work that Jane Lindeman and her team are doing out at the Career Center, trying to get more kids involved in high school to show them that higher education is an opportunity for them. But then certainly, the healthcare aspect of it. And for us, talking about, back to the beginning about how, Black babies have better health outcomes when they have a Black, care provider for them. We have to do better. And that is our goal. Is we're going to continue our pipeline programs like summer nurse and health career camps, where we bring 30 high schoolers to our campus for a 6-week immersion course. Unfortunately, we're not able to have that in 2020 because of the pandemic. We're hoping that we get things under control so we can safely bring them onto our campus in summer of 21. That's what we're committed to. We want to engage our community youth, show them that higher education is absolutely attainable. We're going to need the help of the community, through scholarship programs and things that we can help make higher education affordable for, especially, people who come from lower income families where they think they can't afford higher ed. It definitely takes the help of the community to provide some of the resources necessary.
Thank you.
Rich, can you take the same question that Dave asked?
Well, listen to Jared, I'm having some of the same problems. And the problem comes, when I'm out to the career fairs, whether it's the high schools or others, we are trying to be more diverse and bring in more minorities into our apprenticeship program. And I was at a training last year with a pretty diverse group. And I made the comment to them that I'm having problems trying to draw folks into colored folks into our apprenticeship programs, where we've got opportunities that they would never find anyplace else. I mean, you're getting a college education paid, and you're being paid to be trained in our electrical apprenticeship program. And the brother that I was talking with, he says, Rich, the problem is the color of your skin. You gotta be, they can't relate to you. So where I'm dealing with is, how do I get, whether it's someone else with the right color skin or help with that diversity? We need help as well in the process. And I guess that's one of the things I struggle with is how to make these next steps. It's one thing we want to change policy. It's another thing, are we following through with things in the future that are more than just policy, that this is ongoing? And that's one of the things that I struggle with is how do I reach out more, or do I need someone else there with me that can, again, relate better?
You know, Rich, that actually raises an interesting question for me, though. Naomi, Dr. Naomi, thinking about what Dave has just asked, I do want to ask you somewhat of a twist of the same kind of question, though, particularly since you're in the religious area. You know, the question of the most segregated hour of the day on a Sunday. If community is as racist as we think it is, and this is the reason why we're studying the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, why would oppressed peoples want to spend their free time with their oppressor, their colonizer? Mute.
They wouldn't. I mean, you want to feel safe on your Sabbath. And of course, as a Jew, my Sabbath is Friday and Saturday, not Sunday. So yeah, you'd want to be with your own people where you would feel nurtured.
So is there a problem if Sunday or Saturday or Sabbath is not integrated?
Well, I think it's a problem in the sense that maybe we would get to know each other better that way. And we are all in God's image. But because of racism and because of other forms of prejudice, we don't think that's true. And I think if we're not getting together somehow in a spiritual sense, an ethical sense, we're not going to be able to learn that. But there's resistance to that.
Yeah. Well said. I'm just trying to make sure that you got all your thought out, because you're pensive, and you know, I want to make sure that we're hanging on your every word. Thank you. Thank you. Laura, are you paying attention to what Dave asked earlier? What were your reflections?
What we would do within our own community? Was that the question? Yes. Well, over at UNI, we're doing a number of different committees and councils and groups to check on what is going on within our budgets, to see if DEI work is reflected in our budgets, to see if it's reflected in our policy, not only our school policy, but our educational policy also. So I've got a number of that situation going on and I'll try to keep it brief. For my personal project, I've been looking a lot with the Racial Ethnic Coalition, as Iowa Code sees that all state institutions, especially those who are universities, need to be sourcing some of their furniture from prison industry, and seeing how a lot of Black and Brown communities have been especially impacted by the prison industrial system. That can be especially harmful, as we see. And as we've seen, especially during this pandemic, we've seen reports of prisoners or people who have been imprisoned who are having to do really horrific work without any proper PPE, any of that, or even putting out fires and then not being able to then be firefighters later on. The kind of things, how we criminalize people has been super important. Something that we really need to look at. And so, of course, if we're teaching our students and then they are then using these materials that it's basically modern day slavery, that's not what we want to have our students be teaching on, be eating on, be sleeping on. So that's my own personal project in my community.
Wonderful. Tanya, the same question. We're working with Dave's question. That one thing in community. Tanya Graves.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is continue collaborating with all the organizations that we currently collaborate with. And if there's anyone out there that's listening or watching and you would like to collaborate with the NAACP, we would truly appreciate it, because together we can do great things. Mountains.
Fabulous.
Good. Thank you, Tanya. Chief Hare, how about you? One thing in particular, let me give you a little bit of context. I noticed in the last election, not the one we just had at the 1st of November, but when people were running for the city council positions, they talked a lot about the Hill and made it sound like it was one of the most dangerous places on God's green earth. What are you doing to address, and then when they talked about how dangerous the Hill was, they tended to show images of people of color, which I found very problematic. What are some things that you want to do to challenge people's perceptions of police work on campus and in particular on the Hill?
Well, first, I'm going to have to let you know that the UNI Police Department does not have jurisdiction on the Hill. So
Okay.
that's the Cedar Falls PD area.
All right, then never mind that portion of my question. I'll ask that of Chief Burke.
So
One thing you want to do.
I'm sorry, could you, in relating on
One
to-
thing you want to do in your line of work to be intentionally anti-racist.
Well, I think in one of the things I've actually already started, I think before you can even try to fix or resolve a problem, you have to understand how it came to be. So in our policing profession, I want to help the officers understand why we are where we are right now. I want them to understand and become knowledgeable of the mistakes that were made in the profession and how we can learn from those mistakes and not repeat them. You know, it goes back to the whole, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to own it to a certain degree, that even though, you know, we personally were not there turning the hoses on the civil rights advocates, it was part of an ugly part of our profession. And we need to acknowledge that and understand why we are where we are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And before we go to Mark, can I go to Nafisa Bonye? Same question, Dave's question.
So I think for me, from public health and healthcare perspective, it's important that as a society that we understand that when you look at the life expectancy of the average American in comparable to other countries, we have the shortest life expectancy at 78. So for me, that means that we're not winning. Like none of us, like this system isn't benefiting the majority of Americans. And so I think that, you know, being here in Iowa, when you look at whether it's the low minorities of income minorities of colors and low income whites, there's similarities in the struggles, but the system is set to divide us, right? So that there's this assumption that as long as, you know, I'm a white person doing better than a Black person, I'm doing well. Well, data is showing that you're actually not doing well. And I think that in public health and our healthcare system, it is our responsibility to speak truth to that data and what it means. And so that is the action that I plan to take for the community. But as I stated earlier, again, is that system of accountability. We do have to have systems of accountability in this community, even when we implement policies. So to ensure that once we leave Earth, that at the end of the day, it's still, the community will still thrive.
Fabulous. Same question, Mark, and then I'll turn it back over to Dave.
I guess I'm a perennial optimist, maybe a serial optimist. I don't know. I grew up around here. My family's been here for around here. I, was one of the people that remember that in the early 80s when the unemployment was 25%, and we had films being made about how bad things are around here. And I feel like our community is the kind of community that when we identify a problem like this, and I really appreciate the comments about collaboration. I think what you guys are doing here is absolutely essential. When we as a community put our mind to something, I've found that we can do amazing things. 2008 didn't knock us down. 2016 didn't knock us down. I think this is a big problem. This is a big change. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of energy from a lot of people. My little part of it that I feel like I can help with a little bit, and I've really been for the second part of, I call this my second career, I'm supposed to be retired, is about bringing young people into our community. I guess I feel like, especially after this dialogue, that I need to turn that lens a little bit and really think about making affordable housing a part of what we really want to do, because I think that's really, really key. I think it's just kind of one of those, if people aren't safe and feel at home and welcome, and if they can't find a house that they can live in, it's not a community. We can't build families around that, neighborhoods around those. So I'm here to work with anybody who wants to work on housing.
Thank you, Mark. An answer and a question to deal with before we get towards the end of time. And then Abraham, when we get to the end of time, I want to get into the second to last word, just as a way to thank all these people who've been part of this. A couple people have asked questions that have not come up in the conversation yet. One of those questions was about religious communities working together and dealing with the fears and the assumptions about, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that form of worship. The biggest one I'll run into as a white person worshiping in an African-American church is, what do you mean it's not done in an hour? That kind of assumption that white people are bringing to a service of worship that may be different than what they're used to. And my response to that was, okay, if it's longer than an hour, just stay. You don't have to be a Presbyterian and cough at noon to tell the preacher time to wrap it up. So that's one answer. The question, though, that also came up, Mayor Hart, was the last time when the panel met, and you were on that panel, you talked about specific policies that you had in mind. And one of the questioners asked, what are some of those specific policies that you want to bring up for consideration in the city of Waterloo?
So just really quickly to Dr. Nafisa's point. So does that mean that African Americans, since we have a shorter lifespan and we can collect our retirement and our Social Security, they need to drop that age requirement for us so we can enjoy it just as long? But anyway, that is kind of it is really an interesting question. But no, I did kind of touch on that a little bit earlier, but I was talking so much you may have missed it when I gave the examples of taking a look with an equity lens and asking fundamental questions about every policy we have internally, taking a look at some of the road projects like Highway 63 and redoing and undoing that, some of the street projects where we're giving equal amounts to some of the same wards, but some wards needed more, and those wards are predominantly has a higher concentration of minorities in them. Working with some of the housing practices that we have here, making sure we're holding people more accountable and working in. Some things that we've been doing too, we've been trying to build houses in areas that haven't seen any housing in years, and fighting some one or two city council members that believe that those houses are novelty projects when they are actually houses that people need. So it is continuation of those efforts. It's going to take years, but we're working on that now, and I can see.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief, you've got a grin on your face, which means you've got a pearl of wisdom to share with the group. Let's hear from Chief Fitzgerald here.
No, it wasn't so much a pearl of wisdom. I just, the mayor yielded the floor, so I thought that was funny. again, it's, you're looking at things through an equity lens, and that equity lens can be applied, so many different ways. But I'll bring this back to a police perspective and to a law enforcement perspective and say, yes, I agree with Chief. We weren't there when water hoses and dogs were set upon people, out that were, activists for civil rights. But, right now we have an opportunity to make a change, throughout this industry. And, most police chiefs know now that we have to do it. Either you're seeing an exodus, probably not so much everyone in this panel, but, there are police-related emails that we get from the many different memberships we have across the country. We're seeing a mass exodus of police chiefs across the country. We're seeing that many are leaving because they're unwilling to make some of the changes necessary to proclaim to everyone that they are anti-racist. They're saying, aren't we doing enough? And not sort of applying the mindset that, we need to still put the work in. I applaud, everyone that has been on this, in this conversation, really, because of the realization that we need to do more. But I go back to what I said very early on, and that's, the folks that are traditionally downtrodden, that have the racially polarized people that you may know or come into contact with or want to hire, aren't the ones that need to do all the work. And we have to step out of our comfort zones as a police chief, as a home builder, as a preacher, as an educator. And we step out of our roles of comfort to learn how to talk to people, how to better, exchange information with people that don't walk like us, talk like us, how to listen, how to not misinterpret, what a person is saying because they don't look like us, how to not base things upon just the facade of the person rather than the quality and content of what the person brings to the table. And, I can speak for, I think, people that look like me and say that many of us, don't feel like, again, we have to prove ourselves. And black males in particular have been subject to, unfair and disparate sentences. And when we talk about policy just being enough, remember this. I mean, there's, one of what's the first commandment? Thou shalt not kill, right? And it's against the law to kill, but, Black men were being hanged, and still are being victimized. And we, as leaders, as people now who've read this book, who've been empowered by it, who understand that things need to be done, have to do the work. We can't rely on the people in the communities. We can't rely on them to do what perhaps your parents told you, and that is, why don't those people pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Everybody has the same, everybody has the same opportunity. If you go to school, you work really hard, you're gonna, be able to be successful and feed your family. Well, that's true for some of us, not true for all. And those people that it hasn't been true for generations are the ones that are angry, are the ones that don't articulate themselves necessarily well about this. And it's not because so much that they can't explain themselves, just that they're tired and beaten down. And just by us being exposed to this, having this conversation and saying that we understand and embrace it isn't enough. We have to do the things that reverse that type of feeling, and we have to put the work in. So I hope that everybody leaves this conversation and understands that when you see a swastika or you hear that joke, in that conversation with your friends that's irreverent, towards the Black person in the crowd, that it's not the Black person that has to stand up and say, hey, that's That's not cool. It should be someone other than him standing up and saying it's not cool, because that person understands that it's not something that he or she should have to hear, right? It is on us to make that change and to step in.
That's wonderful. We got about 3 minutes left. And so I just want to make a few comments, and then I turn this over to my co-host, of course, Dave Kivett. But first I want to say to you, Joe Fitzgerald, as I look at you, the light is shining on your head, and there's a glow around your head that tells me you have a prophetic calling on your life. Yeah, I said it.
It's not a halo, it's a glow.
And I just want to close with these comments. I mean, we're talking about how to be an anti-racist, and Dr. Cornel West made a powerful comment. Cornel West, public intellectual, theologian. He once said that if your success is defined as being well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference, then we don't want successful leaders. We want great leaders who love the people enough and respect the people enough to be unbought, unbound, unafraid, and unintimidated to tell the truth. Dr. Cornel West, I hope that we will allow that to permeate our thinking as we continue to move forward in this anti-racism conversation. And Dave Kivett, in our final moments, hope Rick will work with us.
Yes, I hope Rick will. When we started putting this together, we started thinking of the community leaders we wanted, and we set up these panels very intentionally, trying to hear from a variety of community leaders. And we have done a survey of all the people who participated in these book reads. And one of the things that keeps coming up in that survey is it is so good to see our community leaders, to get to know them better, to hear from them about how they're addressing injustice and a lack of equity in our community. So I want to thank all of you for all the work you're doing, for the way in which you've exposed yourself to the larger community with some honesty and some humility and some hopefulness. So I want to thank you very much on that. As one of the people that was trying to put this together, we decided we would have the last panel, one of the last panels, be our political leaders, but we didn't want just the mayors. And I thought, I know who I need to get on there with the mayor, because when it comes to a conversation like this, the one person I want running the anchor leg is LaTanya Graves. LaTanya had put in there that she had a question. So LaTanya, in a room full of preachers and mayors and police chiefs and community leaders, you get the last word.
Okay, so what I'm putting out there is when we're intentionally recruiting people of color, we need to be intentional with their pay grade. Thank you.
That's it? That short statement?
That's it. We need to be intentional with their pay grade, because, you know, history shows us in reports, data, all that good stuff is out there, how we make, what, 61 cents on a dollar?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be intentional. When we're recruiting people of color, be intentional about their pay grade. Yeah. Pay them what they're worth, because I know what I'm worth.
Amen. Mayor Hart, I think, is wanting to say something rather than just giving an amen.
This is very dangerous past 8 o'clock. Just really quickly, I just want to say, you know, the 24/7 Wall Street, the reports, but to see the development of All-In Grocers breaking ground, $8 million project, one of the largest developments for any African American in the entire state of Iowa. That is an accomplishment. So I don't know, history was made yesterday. That is a tremendous, tremendous thing that takes place. You all heard about what happens along the course of opening up a business, challenges for minorities. This is good to see that happen. Over.
Yes. Thank you all very much for being a part of this. We look forward to the work ahead, and we want to hear your ideas about how we can make this a better community and tackle the injustices, do some pruning, to go back to the wonderful image that Chief Fitzgerald left us with. So get your shears out, and I'll see you around the shrubs. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.